At 39, Arthur Vance had nothing left. After his family business went bankrupt and his beloved mother died of a serious illness, he was marginalized, forced to endure freezing winter nights under city bridges, huddled in a tattered coat to escape the cold and the humiliation of life. But the turning point came when he received a will from his maternal grandfather, whom he thought had long been dead. Instead of selling off his only inherited property, a dilapidated, frozen 19th-century stone warehouse on the harbor, for enough cash to rent a place to live and eat, Arthur made a crazy decision. He refused a lucrative compensation offer from the city's largest real estate corporation and moved into the haunted, cold house to search for answers about his family's past. Everyone thought he had completely lost his mind. The millionaire land grabber mocked him as a beggar clinging to a pile of rubble. City inspectors shook their heads, preparing an eviction order, and even the homeless people who used to live next to him laughed, saying Arthur was trading his only chance for a better life for a dilapidated warehouse with not even a square meter of heating. But they didn't know what Arthur saw. While using his last ounce of strength to break through the crumbling brick wall in a hidden corner of the basement to check the structure, Arthur was shocked to discover a massive, ancient piece of iron, a pre-war safe from the previous century. Without a modern combination lock, buried and completely encased in a thick layer of black ice, despite the building's electrical system having died more than half a century ago. On the surface of the safe, someone had used nails to scrape away the rust, leaving a hastily written message: "Do not thaw." The moment Arthur's trembling fingers touched the rough surface of the mysterious safe, a dry, mechanical click echoed from within the ice. A blast of high-pressure cold air from 60 years ago suddenly burst from a crack, extinguishing the flame of the only lighter in his hand. At the same time, the heavy, decisive footsteps of a stranger descended the iron staircase in the darkness. Before we officially begin Chapter 1, I'm curious to know where and at what time you are currently listening to this story. Please leave a comment below to let me know. Your presence is a great motivation for the channel. I wish all listeners a new day filled with energy, peace, and goodness. During the storytelling, if there are any details that are illogical or need improvement, please feel free to comment with your honest suggestions. I always welcome them to improve the quality of the content. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes of this series. Now, put on your headphones, turn the volume down to a comfortable level, and let's begin. The rain in October never just fell. It seeped into the marrow of Arthur Vance's bones like an eviction notice from winter itself. At 39, Artie had learned that the world didn't announce its cruelties with a trumpet. It whispered them in the damp chill of a cardboard-lined alcove beneath the highway overpass on 4th Street. He sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his threadbare canvas jacket offering about as much protection as wet tissue paper. His fingers, permanently stained with the grease of the automotive shop that had laid him off 6 months ago, trembled as he tried to smooth out a damp, crumpled photograph of his mother, Elena. She was smiling in front of a small apartment they had lost to medical bills right before her heart finally gave out. That was the emotional anchor that kept him heavy. A grief so dense it felt like a physical weight in his stomach. His stomach rumbled, a sharp, twisting reminder that his last meal had been a stale sleeve of crackers from a gas station trash bin nearly 24 hours ago. This was his practical problem basic, gnawing survival. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausted. The roar of commuter traffic overhead was a constant, mocking rhythm, reminding him of a society that moved forward while he remained utterly stagnant. He watched the headlights refract through the downpour, a kaleidoscope of indifferent light. Suddenly, the splashing of heavy boots through the puddles broke the monotonous drone of the highway. A man in a yellow plastic slicker, holding a glowing flashlight and a clipboard wrapped in a grocery bag, stepped into the alcove. It was Marcus, a local street outreach worker who had brought Artie a wool blanket 3 weeks prior. Marcus didn't look at Artie with pity. He looked at him with the weary respect of one survivor acknowledging another. "Artie," Marcus said, his voice competing with the thrum of a passing semi-truck. "I've been looking for you for 2 blocks. Someone left something for you at the drop-in center. A lawyer's clerk. They had your old ID photo from the shelter database." Marcus reached into his dry coat and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, sealed with heavy red wax that had begun to crack from the moisture. It was a tangible relationship interaction, a bridge from a world Artie thought had forgotten him entirely. Artie hesitated, his numb fingers reluctant to take the packet. "Lawyers don't look for people under bridges unless they want to lock them up." "Marcus," Artie muttered, his voice raspy from weeks of breathing damp exhaust fumes. Marcus forced the envelope into Artie's hands anyway, giving his shoulder a firm, warm squeeze before turning back into the rain. "This one looks different. Man, just look at it." Left alone under the flickering orange glow of a sodium street lamp, Artie carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a stack of heavy bond paper, crisp and untouched by the squalor surrounding him. The letterhead read, "Holloway and Associates, Attorneys at Law." The text stated that his maternal grandfather, Harlan Vance, a man Artie's mother had claimed died in an asylum when she was a child, had actually passed away only 3 months ago. Furthermore, Harlan had left Artie his sole remaining asset, a deed to a property designated as the Vance Ice House, located at the desolate northern edge of the city's industrial riverfront. Artie stared at the name, Harlan Vance. His mother had lied to him, or someone had lied to her. Why would she tell him his grandfather was dead if he was alive all this time? This was the first clue, a fracture in his own family history. Tucked into the bottom of the envelope was a heavy, tarnished brass key, entirely too large for a modern lock, stamped with the deep, hand-engraved number 1888. The key felt ice-cold against his palm, colder than the October air. He spent the remaining hours of the night staring at that key, watching the rain taper off into a thick, gray fog that swallowed the city skyline. By dawn, the hunger and the sheer driving need for answers forced him to his feet. He walked for nearly 3 miles, his boots squelching with every step, heading away from the familiar downtown core toward the forgotten shipping district. The air grew thicker, smelling of river mud, diesel fuel, and rotting timber. The warehouses here were massive, rusted hulls of a bygone industrial era covered in layers of faded graffiti and creeping ivy. At the very end of Wharf Road, where the pavement gave way to broken cobblestones and cracked earth, stood the Vance Ice House. It was a monolithic 5-story structure built entirely of deep crimson bricks that had turned almost black with age and soot. It had no windows on the lower 3 floors, an architectural necessity for a building designed to keep the heat out and the cold in. The architecture was imposing, a fortress of solid masonry that seemed to reject the very idea of the modern city around it. A massive iron double door guarded the entrance, secured by a heavy, rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been turned in half a century. Artie approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way he hadn't felt in years. He held up the brass key, matching the stamped 1888 to a faint, weathered inscription carved into the lintel above the doorframe. His hand shook as he inserted the heavy key into the lock. To his surprise, the internal tumblers didn't fight him. With a heavy metallic clunk that resonated through his arms, the lock gave way. He pulled the padlock free and pushed against the iron doors. They groaned loudly on dry, ungreased hinges, protesting the intrusion of light and life into a tomb. A wave of air rushed out from the darkness inside, hitting Artie squarely in the face. It wasn't the smell of rot or stagnant water. It was an incredibly intense, unnaturally dry, deep-seated cold that smelled faintly of old pine sawdust, wet iron, and a strange, metallic sweetness. The temperature inside was vastly lower than the crisp autumn morning outside. Artie stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking sharply on the solid granite floors. The darkness was absolute, save for the narrow beam of light cutting through the open doorway behind him. He pulled a cheap plastic disposable lighter from his pocket, flicking the wheel until a small, yellow flame danced in the gloom. The light revealed massive timber pillars supporting a ceiling made of reinforced iron girders. Dust motes danced in the air like frozen stars. As he walked deeper, the ambient sound of the riverfront faded entirely, swallowed by the sheer density of the brick walls. It was silent, save for his own shallow breathing. He found himself in a vast, vaulted holding chamber where giant blocks of river ice would have been stored over 100 years ago. The walls were lined with thick layers of cork and decomposing horsehair insulation, held in place by rotting wooden slats. But as Artie moved his lighter closer to the rear eastern wall, he noticed something impossible. The air here was so cold, his breath formed thick, white plumes that hung suspended in the air. The brickwork on this specific wall didn't look like the rest. It was jagged, uneven, as if it had been hastily torn down and rebuilt by an amateur hand. And there, protruding through a gaping, jagged breach in the masonry, was a massive, matte black iron safe. It wasn't just sitting there. It was completely embedded inside the structural core of the wall itself, held fast by a thick, shimmering casing of solid, unyielding black ice that seemed to be sweating despite the lack of heat. Artie approached the safe, his lighter flame flickering wildly as if caught in an invisible updraft. The safe had no electronic components, no digital face. It was a mechanical relic from the late 19th century, its iron handles shaped like twisting vines. But what froze Artie in his tracks was a detail near the lockbox mechanism. Carved roughly into the ice-encrusted iron of the safe's door, as if scratched in a desperate hurry with a hardened nail, were 3 distinct words: "Do not thaw." Artie reached out, his bare, trembling fingers hovering just inches from the frozen iron handle, wanting to touch it, wanting to understand why his grandfather had hidden this monstrosity inside a wall of solid brick. Just as his skin made contact with the freezing metal, a sharp, deafening sound echoed from the darkness far above his head. The distinct, heavy thud of a boot stepping onto a wooden floorboard on the upper deck, followed by a low, metallic scraping sound that seemed to be moving directly toward the chamber he was standing in. Artie froze, his breath catching in his throat, his lighter flame blowing out completely as the unanswered question of who or what else was inside the ice house hung heavily in the absolute darkness. The echo of the heavy thud from upstairs seemed to hang suspended in the freezing, stagnant air of the cavernous vault, vibrating against the ancient brickwork and sending a genuine shiver straight down Arthur Vance's spine. His thumb, raw and stiff from the biting cold, pressed frantically against the flint wheel of his cheap plastic lighter, sparking it 3 times in the total darkness before a fragile amber flame blossomed back to life to illuminate his terrified face. The small light flickered violently, casting monstrous dancing shadows against the cork-lined walls and the dark, glistening mass of black ice that held the mysterious iron safe captive inside the masonry. Artie stood paralyzed, holding his breath as he strained his ears to track the noise, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, while his mind raced with the terrifying practical problem of being trapped underground, entirely unarmed, with a failing light source and no clear escape route if an intruder blocked the narrow entrance. Every muscle in his 39-year-old body was locked tight, his ears catching the slow, deliberate crunch of heavy boots moving across dry rot and debris on the floor directly above him, accompanied by a low, metallic scraping sound that sent a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, despite the sub-zero temperature of the room. He realized with a sudden pang of vulnerability that his current existence on the streets had taught him to avoid conflict at all costs, to fade into the shadows. But here, inside this monolithic fortress that technically belonged to him, he had nowhere to run. The footsteps paused directly over the vaulted ceiling of the ice chamber, followed by a long, agonizing silence during which Artie could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of his own pulse and the faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the iron girders into the dark recesses of the basement. Then, the sound of shifting weight resonated again, heading not away from him, but toward the rusted iron spiral staircase he had passed near the main entrance, each metallic clang of a heel against the iron steps echoing through the structural columns like a countdown clock. Artie instinctively backed away from the jagged breach in the brick wall where the safe rested, his worn boot heel catching on a chunk of loose mortar and causing him to stumble slightly, the sudden movement causing his lighter to slip from his numb fingers and hit the solid granite floor with a sharp plastic click, plunging him back into an absolute, suffocating darkness. He scrambled on his knees, his hands sweeping across the freezing, grit-covered stone in a desperate search for the smooth plastic casing, his fingernails scraping against the cold floor until his hand brushed against something metallic and heavily oxidized, instead, a long, heavy, rusted iron tool that felt like an old ice pick, its wooden handle splintered and decayed by decades of moisture. As his fingers wrapped around the tool for protection, he finally located the lighter, flicking it open once more just as a bright, powerful beam of a high-powered LED flashlight cut through the darkness from the chamber's arched entryway, blinding him instantly and forcing him to raise his arm to shield his watering eyes. "Don't move, and put down whatever you just picked up off the floor." A sharp, authoritative female voice commanded from behind the blinding wall of light, the tone firm but carrying a distinct undercurrent of nervous tension that mirrored Artie's own fear. Artie blinked against the glare, dropping the rusted iron tool back onto the granite with a loud clang, his voice raspy and cracked as he held his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get out of the cold. This place is supposed to be empty," he stuttered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably from a mixture of advanced hypothermia and pure adrenaline. The flashlight beam shifted slightly downward, illuminating Artie's tattered canvas jacket, his grease-stained jeans, and his soaking wet boots, before slowly tracing the jagged wall behind him where the massive ice-encrusted safe stood embedded in the brickwork. The woman behind the light took a slow, cautious step forward, revealing herself to be in her early 40s, wearing a heavy, practical canvas work jacket with a silver structural engineering emblem pinned to the collar. her dark hair tied back tightly, and a clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like armor. This was Maeve Lynn, a local historical preservationist who had been monitoring the structural decay of the riverfront district for months, and her sudden presence represented a critical relationship interaction that would irrevocably alter the course of Artie's desperate situation. "You must be Arthur," Maeve said, her voice softening slightly as she lowered the flashlight to a reasonable angle, though her eyes remained wide with intense curiosity as she stared past him at the frozen vault. "The legal aid office told me they finally tracked down Harlan Vance's grandson, but I didn't expect to find you down here in the dark on your first day, let alone armed with a rusted ice pick from the 1950s. Artie let out a long, shuddering breath, the white plume of his exhalation hanging between them like a ghost as he leaned his trembling frame against a timber column. A wave of profound emotional exhaustion washing over him as he realized he wasn't about to be attacked, but was instead being confronted by the stark reality of his own public destitution. "How do you know my name? And what are you doing in my grandfather's building?" Artie asked, trying to summon a shred of the dignity he had lost somewhere between the foreclosure of his drafting business and the floor of the 4th Street overpass. Maeve stepped closer, the beams of her heavy-duty light completely washing out the pathetic flame of Artie's lighter, which he finally extinguished and slid back into his pocket with a sense of profound shame. "I'm the director of the city's Industrial Heritage Trust, and for the last 5 years, your grandfather's ice house has been at the top of our endangered structures list," Maeve explained, her eyes darting between Artie's gaunt face and the massive iron safe behind him. "When Harlan died, the city was ready to condemn this entire block and sell it to the highest corporate bidder. But the probate court held it because of a clause in his will that insisted a direct bloodline heir had to personally inspect the structural core before any sale could be finalized." She paused, her gaze settling on the rough, hand-carved words, "Do not thaw," etched into the frost-rimed iron door of the safe, an expression of utter disbelief crossing her features. Artie watched her expression, his architectural training temporarily overriding his exhaustion as he noticed how the thick black ice surrounding the safe seemed completely unaffected by the ambient moisture or the warmth of their breath, remaining perfectly solid, dark, and glassy. This was the central unanswered question that troubled him deeply. Why was a single section of an interior brick wall maintaining a sub-zero temperature capable of producing black ice when the boilers had been dead for over 60 years? And what physical mechanism was keeping this specific vault completely frozen from the inside out? Maeve moved closer to the breach, her practical instincts as an engineer taking over as she reached out a gloved hand to examine the masonry work around the safe, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. "This isn't standard 19th century masonry," she muttered, almost to herself, as she traced the uneven, jagged edges of the brickwork where the safe was embedded. Someone tore down the original structural fire brick and rebuilt this section using a completely different mortar mix, probably sometime in the early 1960s, right around the time the Vance Ice Company abruptly vanished from the tax rolls. She leaned down, her flashlight illuminating the floor where Artie had dropped the rusted tool earlier, her breath catching as she picked it up and held it into the light, revealing a crucial clue that Artie had missed in the dark. Deeply stamped into the rusted iron shaft of the pick were the initials S.V. and C. A mark that did not match his grandfather's initials or the Vance Company name. "Look at this," Maeve said, turning the heavy iron pick over to show Artie the engraving. "These initials stand for Sterling Vault and Company, the old industrial manufacturing firm that used to dominate the Western Canal before they transitioned into commercial real estate development." Artie stared at the initials, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, as he remembered the legal documents in his pocket and the vague, bitter fragments of stories his mother used to tell about the wealthy men who had systematically ruined his grandfather's reputation in the community. An intense emotional moment gripped him as he looked around the freezing, decaying vault, realizing that his grandfather hadn't just been a reclusive miser who abandoned his family. Harlan Vance had been engaged in some sort of desperate, hidden warfare against the powerful forces of the city, using the very infrastructure of this ice house as a shield. "My mother always told me that my grandfather lost his mind at the end," Artie said, his voice dropping to a low, bitter whisper as he wrapped his arms tightly around his torso to combat the worsening chill. "She said he spent every dime he had on maintaining this empty brick shell while we were moving from apartment to apartment, running from landlords and bill collectors, until her heart finally gave out from the stress." He looked up at Maeve, his eyes filled with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that made her pause. "I came here today thinking I could just sign a piece of paper, sell this pile of rotting bricks for a few $1,000s, and finally sleep in a bed with a heater again. But looking at this wall, looking at this safe, it feels like he left me a riddle instead of an inheritance." Maeve looked at him, her expression a mix of professional concern and genuine empathy as she took in his shivering frame and the desperation etched into his face. "If you try to force this property to a quick sale right now, Arthur, the developers will flatten it within 48 hours, and whatever history is locked behind this black ice will be lost under 10 feet of poured concrete," she warned softly, her tone carrying the weight of a severe professional assessment. She turned her flashlight back to the ceiling above the safe, tracing a long, deep, hairline fracture that had begun to spiderweb through the massive timber support beam directly supporting the upper floor. "And that brings us to your immediate practical problem," Maeve continued, stepping back and pulling Artie by the sleeve away from the safe's alcove. "The structural integrity of this entire eastern quadrant is completely compromised. The weight of that iron safe, combined with the thousands of pounds of unnatural ice holding it in place, is pulling the load-bearing masonry downward." She looked him dead in the eye, the beams of her light casting sharp, dramatic shadows across her face. "If you try to chip away at that ice, or tamper with that wall without proper structural shoring, you won't just destroy the safe," she said, her voice dropping to a grim whisper that echoed ominously through the freezing darkness. "The entire 5-story brick superstructure will suffer a catastrophic foundation failure, and this historic ice house will become your absolute, permanent tomb before you ever find out what your grandfather died trying to hide inside it." The terrible groan of the ancient timber support beam seemed to vibrate straight through the soles of Arthur Vance's soaking wet boots, a grim materialization of the practical problem that now held him hostage in the frozen depths of his grandfather's legacy. He stood perfectly still, his body tense and shivering violently as Maeve Lynn adjusted her heavy-duty flashlight, sending a wide, bright beam across the massive hairline fracture that ran like an angry scar down the load-bearing wood directly above the ice-encrusted safe. The air between them was so thick with cold that every breath they drew felt like inhaling crushed glass, creating twin plumes of white mist that swirled together in the harsh LED light before settling over the dark, unyielding block of black ice. Artie wiped a layer of freezing condensation from his nose with the rough, frayed sleeve of his canvas jacket, his fingers so numb they felt like wooden pegs as he looked at the woman who had just threatened him with a structural catastrophe. This was a critical relationship interaction, a tense negotiation for survival between a man who had nothing left to lose and an engineer who treated the decaying brick fortress like a sacred monument. "If this ceiling comes down, It doesn't just bury the safe, Arthur. It drops 5 stories of solid 19th century industrial masonry directly onto our heads, Maeve said, her voice dropping into a tight, quiet register that forced him to lean in closer just to hear her over the distant, muffled thrum of the riverfront traffic outside. Artie looked from the cracked beam to his own trembling hands, a wave of bitter reality washing over him as he realized he didn't even have the money for a hot cup of coffee, let alone the specialized construction shoring equipment required to stabilize a structural failure of this magnitude. It was an intense emotional moment, a suffocating realization of his own complete helplessness that made the weight of his homelessness feel 10 times heavier than it had under the 4th Street Bridge. He wasn't just broke. He was structurally bankrupt, inheriting a riddle that required resources he simply did not possess. I don't have a team of contractors. Maeve and I don't have a bank account, Artie said, his voice cracking from the deep-seated chill in his lungs as he stepped back from the jagged breach in the brickwork, his boot heels clicking hollowly on the granite floor. Yesterday, I was sleeping on waterlogged cardboard, and today I'm supposed to figure out how to prop up a 100-ton brick vault because a grandfather I never knew decided to freeze a safe inside a wall. Maeve didn't pull away. Instead, she lowered her flashlight slightly so the blinding glare didn't hit his eyes, her expression shifting from professional severity to a quiet, observant empathy that caught him completely off guard. Your grandfather didn't just freeze it. Arthur someone engineered this ambient temperature, she murmured, stepping closer to the ice casement and pulling a heavy steel tape measure from her work belt, the metallic zip of the tape snapping sharply in the dead silence of the vault. She measured the thickness of the black ice, her brow furrowing as she noticed that the frost line didn't extend past the false brick facade, meaning the sub-zero temperature was entirely localized, a physical anomaly that defied the natural thermal properties of an abandoned, unpowered building in October. This was a massive, unanswered question that deepened the chill in the room. How could a single vault maintain an active, structural deep freeze for decades without a mechanical compressor running or an active electrical grid attached to the property? Maeve gestured for Artie to follow her away from the compromised eastern wall, leading him back toward the small, dust-covered office near the main iron doors where a rusted iron desk and a single wooden chair sat like relics of a forgotten bureaucracy. The air here was slightly warmer, though still cold enough to keep their hands jammed deep inside their pockets as Artie sank into the creaking wooden chair, his knees aching from the miles he had walked that morning. Maeve set her clipboard down on the scarred green blotter of the desk, pulling a small portable propane heater from her equipment pack and setting it on the floor between them, its small ceramic tile slowly glowing a dull, comforting orange that began to take the edge off the biting frost. We can't touch the safe today, but we can look for the paper trail, Maeve said, her fingers moving rapidly across the drawer handles of the desk until she found one that wasn't completely rusted shut, pulling it open with a sharp screech of metal that made Artie wince. Inside the drawer, buried under a nest of shredded newspaper and dead beetles, lay a thick, leather-bound volume with water-stained edges and a spine that had cracked from decades of neglect. The original Vance Ice Company ledger from the winter of 1952. This was a major clue, a physical link to the precise moment the business began to unravel, its pages filled with neat, fountain pen columns detailing tons of ice harvested from the Northern Channel and delivered to the city's breweries and meatpackers. Artie reached out, his hand still shaking slightly as he carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages, his draftsman's eye immediately catching a sudden, jarring shift in the handwriting around the month of November. The neat, precise ledger entries abruptly stopped, replaced by a frantic, heavy scrawl that dug deep into the paper. recording no ice deliveries, but instead listing repetitive coded expenses for specialized masonry insulators and sterling custom castings. As Artie turned to the final page of that winter season, he discovered that the last 3 pages had been neatly and deliberately excised from the binding with a razor blade, leaving nothing but a jagged line of paper stubs. "Look at the dates," Artie whispered, pointing a stained finger at the missing section, his architectural training allowing him to recognize the deliberate concealment of information. The records end exactly 1 week before the City Council held its first public hearing on the Riverfront Redevelopment Act of 1952. Maeve leaned over his shoulder, her warm breath a stark contrast to the surrounding vault as she examined the empty binding, her face tightening with a sudden realization that connected the old ledger to the modern world outside. "That Redevelopment Act was sponsored by Richard Sterling's father," she said softly, her voice carrying a heavy weight of historical context that made Artie's chest tighten with a familiar, hereditary anger. Before Artie could ask her to elaborate, the heavy iron front doors of the ice house gave a sharp, violent rattle, the sound of metal striking metal echoing through the long brick corridor like a gunshot. Artie bolted to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor as he and Maeve froze, their eyes locked on the narrow hallway that led to the street. A tall, imposing figure in a tailored charcoal overcoat and leather gloves stepped out of the morning fog and into the dim light of the icehouse entry, his polished leather shoes clicking with an arrogant, rhythmic precision that signaled an entirely different kind of danger. It was Richard Dick Sterling himself, the billionaire real estate mogul whose face adorned half the construction billboards in the downtown district. Flanked by a burly assistant carrying a leather briefcase, Sterling looked around the decaying, freezing lobby with a look of profound disgust, his eyes finally settling on Artie's tattered clothes with a cold, calculating assessment that made Artie feel instantly exposed. "Mr. Vance, I presume," Sterling said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of human warmth as he stepped into the office doorway, completely ignoring Maeve as if she were part of the masonry. "I must say, the Legal Aid Society takes their time finding heirs, but I'm glad to see you've managed to locate your new estate." Artie tightened his fists inside his jacket pockets, the memory of his mother's struggles and his own nights under the bridge hardening into a defensive barrier as he faced the man who had driven his family into the mud. "This is private property, Mr. Sterling," Artie said, his voice steadier than he expected it to be, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "And the locks were changed this morning." Sterling offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach his gray, unblinking eyes, reaching into his overcoat and pulling out a crisp, white legal document emblazoned with a gold corporate seal. "I'm fully aware of the title status, Arthur, which is why I'm here to offer you an immediate, practical solution to your rather obvious predicament," Sterling said, tapping the document against his gloved palm with a rhythmic, hypnotic click. "My company holds the development options for the adjacent parcels, and this old brick cooler is nothing but an attractive nuisance that should have been demolished decades ago." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and damp wool overpowering the faint, sweet metallic scent of the ice vault behind them. "I am prepared to wire exactly $250,000 into a bank account of your choosing by noon today," Sterling continued, his voice dropping into a low, persuasive purr that made Artie's stomach twist with an agonizing conflict. 250 grand, Arthur. No inspections, no structural surveys, and no questions asked on one very specific, non-negotiable condition. Artie stared at the document, the sheer size of the number causing a dizzying rush of blood to his ears. That money meant an apartment, hot meals, clean clothes, and an end to the brutal, freezing nights under the highway overpass. It was everything he had prayed for during the last 6 months of misery. "What's the condition?" Artie asked, his voice barely a whisper as Maeve shot him a sharp, warning look from the shadows of the desk. Sterling's smile widened just a fraction, a predatory glint appearing in his eyes as he leaned in, his gloved hand pointing toward the dark corridor that led to the frozen basement vault. "You sign the deed over to my corporate entity right now. You leave the keys on this desk, and you walk out those doors without taking a single item out of this building tonight," Sterling said, his voice hardening into an iron command that sent a sudden, chilling realization straight through Artie's chest. "My crews will be here at dawn with the bulldozers, and I want your word that you won't touch a single brick in that back wall before you leave." Artie stood frozen, the massive financial lifeline dangling directly in front of his face, while the mysterious warning, "Do not thaw," burned in his memory, creating a terrifying cliffhanger of choice as he realized that Sterling didn't want the land. He wanted the safe destroyed before anyone could ever find out what was hidden inside the black ice. The silence that followed Richard Sterling's $250,000 ultimatum was so heavy, it felt as structural as the iron girders holding up the sagging ceiling of the icehouse office. Arthur Vance stared at the crisp, white document resting on the scarred green blotter of the desk, his mind a chaotic storm of numbers, memory, and sheer, exhausting desperation. $250,000 was an impossible amount of money for a man whose total net worth currently consisted of 42 cents, a crumpled photograph of his dead mother, and a tattered canvas jacket that barely kept out the autumn wind. It meant safety, an apartment with radiators that hissed with actual warmth, 3 hot meals a day, and an end to the bone-deep terror of waking up under a highway overpass with frost on his eyelashes. This was an intense emotional moment for Artie, a cruel collision between his survival instincts and a budding, fragile sense of duty to a family history he was only beginning to uncover. He looked down at his grease-stained fingers, then up into Sterling's unblinking, gray eyes, recognizing the predatory calculation hidden behind that polished corporate smile. It was a crucial relationship interaction, a direct test of Artie's resolve against the most powerful real estate developer in the city, with Maeve Lynn standing just a few feet away in the shadows, her breath held in anxious anticipation. "You have until noon to make a decision, Arthur," Sterling said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of human empathy as he adjusted the leather gloves on his hands with a slow, deliberate snap. "But my offer drops by 50,000 for every hour you make my demolition crews wait. So I suggest you take the check, walk away, and let this rotting pile of bricks finally meet its expiration date." He didn't wait for an answer. With a single, dismissive nod, Sterling turned on his polished leather heel and exited the icehouse, his assistant following close behind, leaving the massive iron front doors to swing shut with a hollow, echoing boom that rattled the ancient windows. Artie slumped back into the creaking wooden chair, his head dropping into his hands as the reality of his practical problem settled over him like a physical weight. The immediate issue wasn't just the contract. It was the fact that the portable propane heater Maeve had brought was already sputtering, its flame dying down as the sub-zero chill from the basement vault began to reclaim the office space, threatening to plunge them back into a state of advanced hypothermia if they didn't find a way to stabilize the environment or clear the ice around the safe. Maeve stepped forward from the desk, her expression a mix of fierce historical protection and genuine concern for the shivering man in front of her. "He's terrified of what's in that wall, Artie," she said softly, using his nickname for the first time as she reached into her equipment pack to check the fuel gauge on the dying heater. If that safe just contained old business receipts or empty cash boxes, a man like Richard Sterling wouldn't show up personally at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning with a $250,000 contract designed to bypass every environmental and historical survey in the city code. Her words struck a chord within him, a spark of stubborn pride inherited from a mother who had spent her entire life running from the shadows cast by the Sterling family's corporate expansion. Artie stood up, his joints popping painfully from the cold as he grabbed the leather-bound 1952 ledger they had found earlier. His architect's eye scanning the jagged stubs where the final pages had been cleanly excised with a razor. "We need to find out what he's trying to bury before noon," Artie muttered, his voice raspy but firm as he led Maeve back down the dark, narrow corridor toward the subterranean vault, the temperature dropping drastically with every step they took into the earth. The air in the basement was even more profoundly frozen than it had been an hour ago, creating a dense, white fog that swirled around their faces as Maeve raised her heavy LED flashlight to illuminate the jagged breach in the brick masonry. The massive iron safe remained completely encased in its thick, shimmering jacket of solid black ice, looking less like a piece of office furniture and more like an ancient artifact preserved inside a glacier. Artie approached the false brick wall, his bare hands tracing the uneven mortar joints until his fingers brushed against a small metal object embedded directly into the frozen mud at the base of the foundation. He pried it loose with the tip of his pocket knife, holding it into the bright beam of Maeve's flashlight to reveal a pristine, stamped copper token, about the size of a silver dollar, bearing the inscription, "Vance Ice Company, property of the Riverfront Trust, number 4 *." This was a critical new clue, a physical piece of evidence that contradicted everything the city archives said about his grandfather's company being a simple, independent retail operation. A Riverfront Trust implied a joint legal entity, a collective agreement involving multiple properties or landowners along the canal. "Look at the stamp," Artie whispered, his finger tracing the deeply engraved letters as the cold metal seemed to leach the remaining warmth from his skin. "My grandfather didn't just own an ice house. He was managing a trust for the entire industrial district, and this token was used to verify ownership or access rights to something beneath the riverfront." Maeve leaned closer, her engineer's brain instantly calculating the legal ramifications of the find, as she noted how the token's design perfectly matched the architectural seals used by the city's immigrant laborer unions in the mid-20th century. If Harlan was holding the trust records for the neighborhood families, that means the Sterling family's current deeds to the luxury condo lots down the street might be completely fraudulent, Maeve said, her voice rising with a sudden breathless excitement. "But to prove it, we have to get inside that vault without causing the 5-story brick superstructure to collapse on our heads." She pointed the light back up at the massive hairline fracture spiderwebbing through the timber support beam directly above the safe, which had visibly widened by a fraction of an inch since they had last inspected it. A terrifying reminder of their ticking clock. To solve this immediate engineering crisis, Artie suggested using a slow, controlled thermal displacement method, pulling a series of old, heavy-duty canvas tarps from the office and hanging them like a makeshift curtain around the safe's alcove to trap the heat from their single remaining propane cylinder. As they worked together in the freezing dark, draping the heavy fabric over the rotting wooden insulation slats, Artie felt a profound sense of connection to the space, his hands moving with the familiar, precise rhythms of his old drafting days as he measured the clearance between the ice and the load-bearing masonry. The physical labor brought a temporary warmth to his limbs, but it also brought a sudden, unexpected discovery that sent a chill of a different kind straight through his chest. As he cleared away a pile of rotting hay and decomposing horsehair insulation from the base of the frozen wall to secure the bottom of the tarp, his boot struck a hollow, metallic surface hidden beneath the floor grid. He dropped to his knees, his hands frantically sweeping away 60 years of accumulated soot and dirt to reveal a heavy, iron floor drain that wasn't connected to the city's standard sewer system at all. Instead, the drain featured a wide, reinforced brass grate that was completely dry, completely free of ice, and emitting a faint, rhythmic drip. 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 That didn't sound like melting frost, but rather like a steady echo coming from a vast secondary chamber located deep beneath the granite floorboards they were standing on. This was a massive, terrifying, unanswered question that completely shifted the scope of the mystery. Why would a building designed solely to store ice have an entirely separate, insulated subterranean level beneath its main vault? And what was producing a continuous liquid drip in a room that had been frozen solid for over half a century? Artie pressed his ear against the cold brass grate, his breath catching in his throat as he listened to the hollow, echoing acoustics of the void below, realizing that the safe in the wall wasn't the destination. It was merely the gatekeeper to a much larger, hidden architecture. "Maeve," he whispered, his voice trembling as he pointed his fading lighter down into the black gaps of the drain grate. "The safe isn't just sitting in the brickwork. It's anchored to a vertical shaft that runs straight down into a basement that isn't on any of the city's modern public maps." Before Maeve could answer, a sharp metallic clink echoed from inside the locked safe itself, followed by a sudden, violent hiss of pressurized, ancient air that forced a thick plume of white frost out through the keyhole, instantly extinguishing Artie's lighter flame and plunging the two of them into a terrifying, suffocating darkness that seemed to vibrate with the warning of a long-dead grandfather. The absolute suffocating darkness that swallowed the vault after the sudden, violent hiss from the safe door felt like a physical blow against Arthur Vance's chest, forcing him to take a slow, ragged breath that instantly crystallized in the sub-zero air. His fingers, still trembling from the residual shock of the sound, fumbled frantically in the deep pockets of his tattered canvas jacket until they wrapped around the cold, smooth plastic of his cheap disposable lighter. The flint wheel scraping against his calloused thumb 3 times with a dry, frustrating click before a fragile, amber flame finally burst to life. The tiny dancing light cast long, skeletal shadows across the damp cork insulation and illuminated Maeve Lynn's face, her wide, dark eyes reflecting a mixture of intense engineering fascination and genuine terror as she stood perfectly still. Her hands gripped tightly around her aluminum clipboard. This was a critical relationship interaction, a moment of shared vulnerability in the deep freeze of the subterranean structure where 2 lonely people were forced to rely on each other's breathing, just to keep their bearing in a world that had rejected them both. "Did you hear that?" Maeve whispered, her voice a tiny breathless thread that seemed to freeze into white mist the moment it left her lips. Her gaze locked onto the heavy iron safe embedded in the jagged breach of the brick wall. Artie didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the makeshift curtain of heavy canvas tarps they had rigged earlier to trap the heat from their single, dying propane cylinder. His worn boots crunching softly against 60 years of accumulated soot, dry rot, and frozen grit. The immediate practical problem was closing in on them like a physical vice. The portable heater on the floor was completely dead, its metal grate rapidly cooling to the touch. And without an active heat source, the profound, unnatural chill of the eastern vault was already beginning to seep through the layers of Artie's threadbare clothes, threatening to freeze his joints before they could even decipher the mechanical puzzle his grandfather had left behind. He looked down at the heavy brass grate of the floor drain, where he had previously heard the rhythmic drip, drip, drip. But to his utter astonishment, the sound had completely stopped, replaced by a low, hollow hum that vibrated faintly through the granite floorboards beneath his feet, like the distant purr of a sleeping animal. This was a massive, unsettling, unanswered question that deepened the mystery of the ice house. What could possibly cause a completely unpowered, abandoned municipal structure to produce an active, vibrating resonance directly beneath a sealed, subterranean vault? And what kind of machinery had Harlan Vance hidden away from the world in the winter of 1952? Artie dropped to his knees, ignoring the biting bite of the cold stone against his bruised legs, and held the lighter close to the gaps in the dry brass grate, trying to peer into the absolute blackness of the secondary level while Maeve knelt beside him, the warm weight of her shoulder pressing against his arm in a quiet gesture of solidarity that made his chest tighten with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. It was a profound emotional moment for a man who had spent the last 6 months being treated like a ghost on the streets, an invisible entity passing through the cracks of a wealthy city. Here, in the freezing dark, someone was actually looking at him, waiting for his architectural mind to find a path forward through the ruins of his own family name. My mother always told me that when my grandfather shut down the ice company, he spent 3 weeks down here by himself with a sledgehammer and a truckload of imported mortar, Artie said, his voice raspy and shaking slightly from the creeping hypothermia as he reached out to trace the stamped letters on the copper token he had found earlier. The neighborhood thought he was just a broken old man losing his mind after his wife passed away. But look at the alignment of these granite foundation blocks. Maeve, he wasn't destroying this basement. He was reinforcing it to act as a literal vault for the entire canal district. Maeve adjusted her heavy LED flashlight, turning the beam onto the jagged line of brickwork around the safe, her engineer's eye scanning the precise structural load points where the massive timber beam overhead was spiderwebbing with new, hairline fractures from the immense weight of the ice. As she moved the light lower, the bright beam caught a glint of reflective metal deep within the dark, gaping crevice where the safe was anchored, revealing a critical new clue that had been completely concealed by the thick casing of black ice until their makeshift tarp system had initiated a microscopic surface thaw. A heavy, stamped lead seal, identical to the ones used by the Federal Treasury and the Municipal Records Bureau in the mid-20th century, was clamped around a thick bundle of insulated copper grounding wires that ran vertically out of the safe's base and disappeared directly into the granite floor. "Artie, look at the seal," Maeve murmured, her fingers gently brushing away a layer of wet frost to reveal the deeply engraved numbers 1961-B, a date that perfectly aligned with the final, bitter legal feud between Harlan Vance and Richard Sterling's father over the riverfront land deeds. This isn't a simple business safe. These wires are part of a localized, low-voltage electrolytic system designed to use the natural mineral content of the river water to maintain a continuous, structural ice barrier around the masonry. The revelation hung in the air like a heavy weight, answering how the ice house maintained its freezing core while simultaneously raising a terrifying new problem. If the ice around the safe wasn't a natural byproduct of weather, but a deliberate engineered barrier powered by an ancient subterranean network, then attempting to break the ice or cut the safe out of the wall would instantly ground the electrical current, causing the entire load-bearing infrastructure of the eastern wall to collapse into the hidden basement below. Before Artie could fully process the structural danger, a sharp, loud scrape echoed from the staircase near the main entrance, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of several pairs of boots moving rapidly down the concrete corridor toward the vault room. Artie scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs as he shoved the copper token into his pocket and blew out his lighter flame, pulling Maeve back into the deep shadow behind the canvas curtain, just as a wide, powerful beam of light illuminated the arched entryway of the chamber. It wasn't Richard Sterling this time, but rather a pair of city building inspectors clad in bright neon vests, carrying digital thermographic cameras and yellow eviction notices, flanked by a local police officer whose heavy leather belt creaked ominously in the dead silence of the room. "Is there anyone down here?" the officer called out, his voice boisterous, echoing off the wet brickwork with an administrative coldness that made Artie's stomach twist into a tight knot of panic as he realized they were only hours away from the noon deadline Sterling had set. "We have a structural hazard report filed by Sterling Development Group. This building has been declared an immediate public safety risk, and all occupants must vacate the premises for emergency condemnation procedures." Maeve stepped out from behind the tarp before Artie could stop her. Her flashlight held low as she raised her historical trust credentials in an attempt to block the immediate bureaucratic takeover of the property. "I am Maeve Lynn, Director of the Industrial Heritage Trust, and this structure is currently under an active probate evaluation," she said, her voice firm and ringing with a professional authority that forced the inspectors to halt their advance near the center of the vault. The officer didn't look impressed. He stepped forward, tapping a printed city council directive against his clipboard with a slow, dismissive rhythm. "The probate status doesn't override a Level 4 structural emergency, Ms. Lynn," the officer replied, pointing his light toward the massive hairline fracture in the timber support beam directly above the safe, which was visibly weeping a dark, rusty moisture under the stress of the building's shifting weight. "This place is a death trap, and Mr. Vance has 30 minutes to sign the emergency stabilization waiver over to the city's designated contractor, or we will clear this block by force." Artie stepped out of the shadows then, his tattered jacket and grease-stained hands a stark contrast to the clean uniforms of the city officials. A deep, hereditary anger burning through his exhaustion as he realized that Sterling was using the city's own safety codes as a weapon to seize the ice house before the noon deadline. "I'm Arthur Vance," he said, his voice dropping into a steady, dangerous register that made the officer pause. "This is my grandfather's land, and I'm not signing anything until I see the independent engineering report that proves this beam can't be shored up manually." The head inspector chuckled softly, a condescending sound that echoed through the cold vault as he lifted his digital thermographic camera, pointing the lens directly at the false brick wall where the safe was embedded. "You don't understand, Mr. Vance," the inspector said, turning the camera's glowing screen toward Artie to reveal an impossible, blinding white thermal signature emanating from inside the iron safe itself. A heat reading so intense, it defied the fact that the outside of the vault was completely frozen solid. "The core of your grandfather's safe isn't cold at all, according to our sensors. Whatever is locked behind that black ice is currently burning at over 90 degrees, and the thermal expansion is what's actively splitting your foundation apart from the inside out." The glowing, digital green numbers on the city building inspector's thermographic camera seemed to burn directly into Arthur Vance's retinas, flashing a reading of 92 degrees Fahrenheit from the exact geometric center of a safe that was physically encased in 6 inches of solid black ice. Artie stood paralyzed in the small patch of shadow beneath a rotting canvas tarp. His breath caught in his throat as the visual paradox twisted his architectural mind into knots, forcing him to face the immediate, terrifying practical problem that his 30-minute eviction countdown was now ticking away under the cold, unlinking gaze of the local police officer. The municipal air in the subterranean vault felt heavier now, charged with the smell of wet wool, administrative authority, and the faint, sulfurous tang of ancient battery acid that seemed to be weeping from the base of the foundation. This was a critical relationship interaction, a high-stakes standoff between a man who had spent the last 6 months being scraped off the city's sidewalks and a pair of uniform-wearing bureaucrats who saw this historic ice house as nothing more than a liability to be flattened before the noon corporate deadline. Maeve Lynn took a swift step forward, her heavy work boots snapping sharply against the granite floorboards as she positioned her body directly between the head inspector and the jagged breach in the brick masonry. Her historical trust badge held high like a shield against the encroaching city equipment. "Your thermographic readings are completely anomalous, Inspector, and you know it," Maeve said, her voice vibrating with a fierce, protective resonance that made Artie's chest tighten with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion as he realized this woman was risking her entire professional reputation to defend the ruined honor of a family she didn't even know. It was an intense emotional moment for Artie, watching someone fight for his name while he stood there in a tattered canvas jacket, his fingers permanently stained with automotive grease, looking every bit like the vagrant the city assumed he was. The head inspector didn't lower his camera. Instead, he tapped the digital display, his face tightening with a mixture of defensive arrogance and genuine bureaucratic confusion, as the device recorded a microscopic widening of the load-bearing fracture in the timber support beam directly above their heads. Anomalous or not, Ms. Lynn, a thermal variance of this scale inside a structurally compromised, load-bearing partition wall constitutes an immediate kinetic hazard under Municipal Code Section 42, the inspector replied, his voice dry, practiced, and entirely devoid of human empathy as he gestured for the police officer to step closer to the makeshift canvas curtain. "If Mr. Vance refuses to sign the emergency stabilization waiver within the next 20 minutes, I'm legally authorized to declare this property an active public nuisance and clear the block using emergency police powers." Artie looked at the officer's heavy leather utility belt, hearing the dry creak of the leather as the man shifted his weight, a stark reminder of how easily the system could crush him back into the mud of the 4th Street overpass if he made a single wrong move. He reached into his pocket, his numb fingers brushing against the cold, stamped copper token he had found earlier, using the physical sensation of the engraved letters Vance Ice Company, property of the Riverfront Trust No. 4, to anchor his thoughts against the rising tide of panic. This token was a massive clue, a physical contradiction to the city's official narrative that his grandfather was a solitary madman. It proved that Harlan Vance was operating a collective legal entity designed to protect multiple properties along the old shipping canal from being seized by corporations like the Sterling Development Group. "Wait," Artie said, his voice raspy and cracked from weeks of breathing damp exhaust fumes, but carrying a sudden architectural authority that made both the inspector and the officer pause near the edge of the vault's arched entry. He stepped out of the deep shadow, his posture straight despite the biting cold as he pointed a grease-stained finger toward the base of the safe where the thick bundle of insulated copper grounding wires disappeared into the granite floor. "Look at the localized frost line on the masonry," Artie continued, his mind tracing the low-voltage electrolytic diagrams he had studied years ago during his drafting apprenticeship. "The ice isn't a natural buildup, and it's not a thermal failure. My grandfather wrapped this vault in an old low-voltage protection circuit that uses the river water's mineral content to keep the masonry chilled. But something inside that iron casing is generating a localized electrical resistance. The head inspector lowered his camera by an inch, his brow furrowing as he looked from Artie's tattered clothes to the precise, professional alignment of the copper grounding wires. Realizing that the homeless man standing before him possessed a technical understanding of the building's infrastructure that no corporate surveyor had bothered to investigate. This realization created a tense, quiet shift in the room's dynamic, a temporary truce bought with pure engineering logic. But it also highlighted a terrifying, unanswered question that hung over the entire baseline mystery. If the safe was acting as a high-resistance electrical ground for a subterranean circuit, what physical object could possibly remain at 92 degrees Fahrenheit inside a deep-freeze environment for over 60 years without an external power source or a running chemical reaction? Maeve seized on the inspector's hesitation, pulling a thick folder of historical boundary maps from her clipboard and spreading them out across the top of a rusted iron barrel nearby, the crisp snap of the paper echoing hollowly through the damp brick vault. "Arthur is right," Maeve said, her finger tracing a faded blue line that marked an ancient, unmapped overflow channel connecting the icehouse basement directly to the city's Western Canal network. "If you force an emergency stabilization waiver today, your contractors are going to pump high-density polyurethane grout straight into these foundation cracks to level the floor, which will permanently sever these grounding wires and flood the subterranean channel with toxic chemical runoff." She looked the inspector dead in the eye, her voice dropping into a stern, warning register that carried the weight of a severe legal threat. "If that grout hits the public waterway without a certified environmental impact assessment, your department will be tied up in federal district court before the concrete even dries. And Richard Sterling won't be able to touch this block for the next 5 years. The inspector looked at the map, then at his glowing camera screen, the bureaucratic calculations running behind his eyes, as he weighed the immediate pressure from Sterling's office against the terrifying prospect of a federal environmental lawsuit that could cost him his state license. He let out a long, irritated sigh, sliding his digital camera back into its leather hip holster and turning toward the police officer with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "All right, Ms. Lynn. You've got exactly until the noon deadline to produce a certified structural shoring plan signed by a licensed engineer, or the eviction notice becomes active automatically," the inspector muttered, his tone bitter as he reached into his vest pocket to pull out a yellow, tri-replicated citation form. "But I'm noting on this official record that the eastern timber support beam is exhibiting active kinetic deflection, and if that wood splits by even a millimeter before 12 o'clock, the police department is clearing this building regardless of your pending probate status." He slapped the yellow form down onto the rusted barrel next to Maeve's historical maps, turned on his heel, and marched out of the subterranean vault, his heavy boots clicking a rapid, angry rhythm up the concrete corridor, with the officer following close behind until the distant slam of the main iron doors signaled their departure. The sudden silence that reclaimed the ice chamber was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic purr of the mysterious, subterranean vibration beneath their feet and the frantic, shallow breathing of two exhausted people who had just bought themselves less than 3 hours of survival. Artie collapsed against the nearest timber pillar, his legs shaking violently as the adrenaline left his system, leaving him feeling hollow, frozen, and deeply aware of his own physical deterioration. Maeve walked over to him, her face pale but her eyes burning with a stubborn, brilliant light as she reached out and gently took his grease-stained hand in hers, her palm feeling incredibly warm against his ice-cold skin in a quiet relationship interaction that broke through his defensive barriers. "We did it, Artie," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his with a genuine, unvarnished solidarity that made him look away to hide the tears blurring his vision. "We stopped them for now, but we need to find a way to stabilize that timber beam before noon, or Sterling's lawyers won't even need a demolition crew. The building will condemn itself." Artie wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his architect's brain forcing him to focus on the immediate practical problem of finding structural shoring materials inside an abandoned 1950s industrial warehouse. He stood up, using his flashlight to scan the dark corners of the large holding chamber until the beam caught a stack of heavy, weathered oak timbers tucked away behind an old wooden tool chest near the western wall, remnants of the building's original maintenance stock that had survived decades of neglect. As he dragged one of the heavy 6x6 beams across the granite floor, the wood leaving a clean, dark streak through the 60 years of accumulated soot, his boot struck a loose piece of iron molding near the base of the old tool chest, causing the entire wooden structure to tilt forward with a loud, splintering crash. The decayed bottom of the chest ruptured entirely, spilling a collection of rusted wrenches, oil rags, and dead beetles across the floor. But as Artie knelt down to clear the debris so he could mount the shoring timber, his eyes caught a glint of tarnished silver buried deep within the rotted lining of the chest's hidden drawer compartment. He reached in, his fingers closing around a heavy, leather-bound pouch that felt remarkably dry and intact compared to the surrounding decay, his heart hammering against his ribs as he pulled it into the bright light of Maeve's flashlight. With trembling hands, Artie unbuckled the leather strap, revealing a pristine velvet-lined interior that held a collection of 6 handwritten personal letters dated between October and November of 1961. All written in a delicate, elegant script that matched his mother's childhood journals, but addressed directly to his grandfather, Harlan Vance, under a frantic, desperate pseudonym. This was a critical new clue, a cache of hidden family records that completely shattered the timeline of the inheritance. But as Artie unfolded the top letter, his eyes locked onto a single paragraph that changed the entire nature of the danger they were facing. "Dear Father," the text read, the faded black ink digging deep into the expensive stationery. "The Sterlings have hired a private locksmith from the Western Canal to drill the vault casing from the underside of the foundation tonight. They know you hid the collective riverfront deeds inside the central core, and if they find the 3-pronged mechanical key before the council vote on Friday, they will burn the entire immigrant settlement to the ground to erase the property registry." Artie's breath caught in his throat as he looked up at Maeve, his face turning completely pale in the LED glare as a sudden, terrifying realization connected the old letter to the modern structural hazard report. Before he could speak, a low metallic grinding sound resonated from directly beneath the granite floorboards they were standing on. Not the rhythmic purr of the ancient vibration, but the unmistakable, slow, heavy screech of a diamond-tipped industrial drill bit biting into the reinforced iron casing of the safe's hidden vertical shaft from the sealed secondary basement level below them, proving with a terrifying clarity that someone was already inside the hidden architecture of the building, working in the absolute darkness to force the vault open from the inside out before the noon deadline could ever arrive. The horrific, metallic shriek of the industrial drill bit tearing into the reinforced iron casing beneath the granite floorboards seemed to vibrate through Arthur Vance's teeth, a brutal, invasive sound that shattered the freezing silence of the ice house and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his exhausted, aching limbs. He stood paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his hands still clutching the heavy leather pouch of his mother's hidden letters, before he lunged toward Maeve Lynn, his grease-stained fingers catching the heavy canvas sleeve of her work jacket to pull her deeper into the protective shadow of the massive brick pillar. This was a frantic, terrifying relationship interaction, their breath mingling in a single, ragged cloud of white mist as they stood chest to chest in the absolute dark, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical agony of the hidden machine grinding away at the foundation of the building. The immediate practical problem was catastrophic. The city inspectors had just warned them that any active kinetic deflection or structural shift would trigger an automatic forced police eviction. And now someone was actively boring into the subterranean shaft from an unmapped lower level, creating a vibrating resonance that was actively threatening to bring the entire 5-story brick superstructure crashing down around their ears. Artie's mind raced through his years of architectural drafting training, trying to visualize the structural blueprint of the vault while the physical vibrations beneath his boots grew more pronounced. A steady, rhythmic thrumming that told him the drill was operating with an immense amount of hydraulic pressure. "They're bypassing the safe entirely," Artie whispered, his voice a raw, jagged rasp that barely carried over the deafening mechanical screech echoing from the floor drain. "They aren't trying to pick the lock or melt the black ice from the room. They're drilling up through the structural bedrock to puncture the safe's vertical anchoring shaft from the bottom." Maeve gripped his forearm, her fingers digging through the thin fabric of his tattered canvas jacket with a fierce, terrified strength that anchored him against the rising tide of panic. "The blueprint we saw in the archives showed a secondary maintenance level, Artie, but there's no record of a modern access point anywhere on the municipal street grid," she said, her eyes wide and dark in the dim, refracted light of her lowering flashlight as she tried to match his architectural logic with her own engineering knowledge. "If they're down there right now, they didn't come through the front doors. They must have used the old overflow canal intake from the riverfront, which means they've been planning this subsurface intrusion long before you ever broke the legal wax seal on your inheritance papers." This realization introduced a massive, terrifying, unanswered question that hung heavily over the entire baseline mystery. Who could have known about the exact subterranean layout of the icehouse's hidden vertical shaft to launch a targeted underwater or underground drilling operation? And how had they managed to smuggle heavy industrial-grade boring equipment into a sealed municipal waterway without alerting the Harbor Patrol or the Historical Trust? Artie pulled his flashlight from his pocket, his hand shaking so violently that the beam danced erratically across the granite floorboards, illuminating the deep, dark cracks in the stone where 60 years of accumulated soot and frozen grit were being actively shaken loose by the vibration below. "We have to find the entry hatch to that lower level before they cut through the grounding wires and trigger a foundation collapse," Artie muttered, his engineering instincts hardening into a desperate, stubborn resolve as he began to move systematically toward the dark, western perimeter of the vault room. The pacing of his search was slow and agonizing, his boots dragging through the freezing dampness as he used his light to inspect the base of every timber pillar, his body screaming with the accumulated toll of hunger, sleep deprivation, and the biting, unnatural cold that seemed to leach the very life from his bones. Maeve followed closely behind, using her clipboard to shelter her flashlight beam so it wouldn't cast a betrayal of light through the cracked windows above. Her movements deliberate as she helped him scan the uneven masonry for any sign of a hidden hinges or an overlooked iron ring. In the furthest, most neglected corner of the subterranean chamber, beneath a massive 5-foot-tall mountain of rotting, compressed salt marsh hay and ancient straw that had traditionally been used to insulate the stored river ice blocks during the hot summer months of the late 19th century, Artie noticed a slight indentation in the floor joints. The ancient straw was damp, mold-encrusted, and giving off a thick, suffocating smell of sweet decay and wet earth that made his throat tighten as he dropped to his knees, using his bare, grease-stained hands to frantically claw through the decades of compacted vegetation. It was a brutal, physically exhausting obstacle. The straw was frozen together in thick, heavy mats that tore at his fingernails and sent splinters of sharp wood deep into his palms. But he refused to stop, his chest heaving as the desperate, primal need to protect this final, fragile connection to his family drove him forward through the pain. Maeve dropped down beside him, ignoring the ruin of her professional clothing as she used a small steel crowbar from her tool belt to help him pry apart the frozen layers of hay, their shared exertion creating a rhythmic, heavy pattern of breathing that seemed to counter the mechanical screech of the drill below. After nearly 10 minutes of agonizing labor that left Artie's hands bleeding and raw, the crowbar struck a heavy, solid metallic surface with a loud, hollow clink that resonated through the floorboards. They cleared away the remaining handfuls of rotted grass to reveal a massive, iron-reinforced oak hatch cover, completely flush with the granite floor, its surface covered in a thick layer of protective animal fat grease that had preserved the timber for over half a century. But as Artie wiped a section of the iron trim clean with his sleeve, his eyes caught a striking, modern anomaly that shattered the historical preservation of the scene. A fresh, bright smudge of heavy, synthetic blue industrial lubricant smeared across the rusted iron pull ring, and lying just 2 inches away in the cleared dirt was a discarded plastic cap from a specialized hydraulic fluid container. This was a critical new clue, an undeniable physical proof that the driller had used this exact hatch to access the sub-basement within the last 24 hours, leaving behind a trail of modern equipment that completely stripped away any illusion that this was an abandoned, forgotten space. "Someone was here last night," Artie whispered, his finger touching the wet blue grease with a look of profound disbelief. "They didn't come from the river canal. Maeve, they came down through this very room while I was sleeping under the bridge on 4th Street, which means they have a key to the main iron doors. Or someone on the inside gave them access to the building before the probate court could even process my name." The realization brought on an intense emotional moment for Artie, a sudden, suffocating wave of grief and betrayal that made him slump against the heavy oak hatch, his head dropping as the memory of his mother's lifetime of poverty and hidden terror came rushing back to him with a crushing weight. He realized with a terrible, clear clarity that his family hadn't just been running from bad luck or economic downturns. They had been hunted by a patient, corporate machine that had been waiting for 60 years for Harlan Vance to die so they could finally erase the evidence hidden inside these walls. And he, a homeless draftsman with nothing but a tattered jacket to his name, was the only thing standing between those immigrant families' histories and absolute destruction. "My mom died thinking her father hated her because he wouldn't sell this place to buy her medicine," Artie choked out, his voice breaking in the dim light as a hot tear tracked through the soot on his cheek before freezing against his skin. She spent her final days in a public ward, watching the monitors tick down. While this entire time, millions of dollars in land rights and the literal survival of her old neighborhood were rotting inside a frozen wall because he couldn't trust his own blood to keep the secret. Maeve didn't say a word. Instead, she reached out and placed her warm, bare hand flat against his back, her steady, unblinking presence providing a quiet, human anchor that allowed him to pull himself back from the brink of total emotional collapse. "Your grandfather didn't keep the secret to hurt her. Artie, he kept it because he knew that the moment the Sterling family found out he had an heir, That air would become a target, she said softly, her voice steady and resolute as she pointed her flashlight down at the iron pull ring of the hatch. And right now, you are the target, which means we have to open this door and face whatever is down there before that drill bit cuts through the primary grounding wire. Artie nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve as he gripped the heavy iron ring, his muscles straining against the immense, rusted weight of the oak panel as Maeve inserted her steel crowbar into the seam to provide leverage. They pulled together with a coordinated, desperate heave, their boots slipping on the wet granite until the ancient hinges gave a loud, agonizing shriek of protesting metal, and the hatch cover slowly swung upward, revealing a dark, vertical shaft lined with rusted iron rungs that dropped straight into the absolute blackness of the secondary basement level. A thick, foul-smelling wave of warm, stagnant water vapor and the sharp, burning odor of overheated machinery rushed up from the opening, confirming that the drilling operation was reaching its critical climax just a few feet below their positions. The mechanical screech of the drill suddenly stopped, plunging the entire 5-story ice house into a ringing, terrifying silence that was far more menacing than the noise had been. The sudden cessation of sound indicating that the operator below had either finished their penetration or had heard the loud groan of the hatch hinges above them. Artie leaned over the opening, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense, warm vapor to reveal a flooded concrete floor about 12 feet below, the water shimmering with an oily rainbow sheen of hydraulic fluid. But before he could lower his foot onto the first iron rung, a sudden violent shudder ran through the entire structural frame of the eastern vault. The granite floorboards beneath their knees groaned as a massive kinetic displacement of weight occurred along the load-bearing partition, the localized ice casing around the safe cracking with a sound like a pistol shot as the thermal variance reached its breaking point. A loud, sickening crack echoed from the primary timber support beam directly above their heads, and before Maeve could scream a warning, a massive 10-foot section of the secondary ceiling joist snapped under the immense downward pressure, cascading downward in a shower of splintered oak, heavy mortar, and iron-hard brickwork that struck Artie squarely across his shoulders and pinned his left leg beneath a crushing, unyielding weight of structural debris, smashing his flashlight against the stone and plunging the entire subterranean chamber into a total, agonizing, and absolute pitch-black darkness that echoed with his own sharp cry of pain. The dust from the partial ceiling collapse hung thick and chalky in the absolute dark, smelling of ancient mortar, rotted animal fat grease, and the distinct, sulphurous sting of a short-circuiting battery. Arthur Vance lay pinned beneath the heavy, splintered weight of the oak joist, his cheek pressed flat against the freezing granite floorboards as a wave of hot, throbbing agony radiated from his trapped left ankle. He couldn't move his lower body. The crushing weight of the masonry held him fast, and his cheap plastic flashlight had been completely pulverized in the impact, leaving him utterly blind in the deep-seated chill of his grandfather's fortress. "Maeve," Artie choked out, his voice cracked, raspy, and barely louder than a whisper as the dust settled in his throat. A sharp pang of terror gripping his heart as he realized she had been standing directly under the secondary support path when the timber split. For a long, agonizing moment, the only response was the distant, muffled thrum of the riverfront city outside and the ominous, heavy silence radiating from the open iron hatch just a few feet away, where the industrial drilling machine below had so abruptly stopped its mechanical shriek. Then, a low, painful groan cut through the blackness to his left, followed by the dry rustle of old insulation boards and the scraping of boots against the stone floor. This was a critical relationship interaction, a moment of profound, shared survival in the dark as Maeve Lynn dragged herself toward the sound of his breathing, her hands sweeping the floor until her warm, dust-covered fingers brushed against his tattered canvas sleeve. "I'm here, Artie. I'm here. Don't try to move," she breathed, her voice trembling violently with a mixture of shock and sheer adrenaline as she checked her own limbs for injuries before leaning over his penned frame. The warmth of her hand pressing against his shoulder provided a sharp, emotional contrast to the biting cold of the masonry, breaking through the defensive, cynical barriers Artie had built during his 6 months of sleeping under the highway bridge. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, someone was actively refusing to abandon him in the ruins. It was an intense emotional moment, a sudden, heavy realization that his life still had value to another human being, even as his leg throbbed with a sickening heat that threatened to plunge him into unconsciousness if the structural weight wasn't lifted soon. Maeve reached into her utility belt, her fingers fumbling with a small emergency backup light, a slender pen light that clicked on with a fragile, piercing white beam that barely cut through the thick haze of floating soot and horsehair insulation. The dim light revealed the true horror of their situation. A massive 100-pound oak beam was wedged across Artie's ankle, held down by a cascade of heavy, original fire bricks that had peeled away from the primary partition wall holding the frozen safe. To lift it manually was an engineering impossibility for Maeve alone, especially with the noon deadline set by Richard Sterling's corporate lawyers rapidly approaching on the clock. Maeve didn't panic. She used her structural training to survey the debris, identifying a long, intact piece of old iron trim that had broken off from the maintenance chest, and began to carefully slide it beneath the heavy oak timber to create a rudimentary Class 1 lever. "When I lift, you have to drag your foot backward, Artie," she instructed, her teeth chattering from the worsening hypothermia as she braced her feet against a solid granite block and threw her entire body weight against the iron bar. The metal creaked loudly, the load-bearing wood shifting by a fraction of an inch, as Artie let out a sharp cry of agony, biting his lip until it bled as he dragged his mangled boot out from beneath the crushing shadow of the beam. He lay on his back, panting and shaking as Maeve dropped beside him, immediately using her hands to verify that the leather of his boot hadn't split entirely, confirming that while his ankle was severely sprained and bruised, the bone wasn't protruding through the skin. They were battered, freezing, and exhausted. But as Artie used the support of the pillar to pull himself into a sitting position, the beam of Maeve's penlight caught a bizarre structural anomaly inside the cavity left by the fallen ceiling joist, in the exact spot where the secondary timber had torn away from the masonry wall directly beneath the frozen safe. A hidden, vertical mechanical mechanism was now completely exposed to the light. It wasn't made of modern industrial steel, but rather intricate hand-polished brass gears and heavy copper levers that had been built directly into the core of the building's 19th century foundation, entirely separate from the modern safe casing. This was a critical new clue, a physical link that connected his grandfather's mid-century modifications back to the original construction of the ice house in 1888. Intrigued, Artie reached into the structural cavity, his fingers brushing past a layer of ancient, dry tallow grease until they struck a small, cold object wrapped tightly in an old, oil-soaked canvas cloth that had been tucked inside the brass gear assembly. He pulled it free, carefully unwrapping the fabric to reveal a heavy, solid bronze key with 3 distinct, elongated prongs at the tip. A specialized mechanical instrument that matched no modern lockbox, but perfectly aligned with the custom 3-pronged keyhole described in the historical archives of Sterling Vault and Company. "It's the key," Artie whispered, his voice shaking with a sudden, breathless awe as he held the bronze object in the palm of his bleeding hand. My grandfather didn't just hide the deeds inside the safe. Maeve, he built a physical release mechanism into the floor itself, so that if anyone tried to drill or destroy the wall from the outside, the safe would drop straight down into the secondary basement to preserve the papers. This discovery provided a brilliant piece of the historical puzzle, but it also introduced a terrifying, immediate, unanswered question that made the remaining hairs on Artie's neck stand on end. If the three-pronged mechanical key had been hidden up here in the ceiling cavity the entire time, what physical object or mechanism had the intruder below been using to activate the heavy industrial drill? And why had the drilling stopped the exact moment the ceiling joist collapsed? Maeve leaned over the open iron hatch cover, her penlight cutting through the thick, warm water vapor rising from the secondary basement level to illuminate the flooded concrete floor 12 feet below. The water was perfectly still now, shimmering with a dark, oily film. But as she traced the beam of light across the submerged foundations, she noticed a long, thick shadow stretching from the base of the safe's anchoring shaft toward the old canal overflow intake. It was an abandoned, heavy-duty diving suit from the 1960s, its brass helmet reflecting the light with a dull, ghostly glint as it sat propped against the concrete wall like a silent sentinel. Lying directly beside the vintage diving gear was a highly modern, battery-powered, waterproof drill rig, its diamond-tipped bit still embedded deep within the iron casing of the vertical shaft. But the operator was nowhere to be seen. The ring of absolute, dead silence inside the monolithic brick cooler was suddenly broken by a sharp, heavy click from the corridor upstairs, the distinct, echoing sound of the front iron doors being opened from the street, followed by the slow, arrogant, and rhythmic clicking of polished leather shoes moving down the main hallway toward the vault chamber. It wasn't the city inspectors this time, and it wasn't a team of contractors. The weight of the footsteps was singular, purposeful, and carried the unmistakable administrative authority of Richard Sterling himself, accompanied by the cold, metallic rattle of a pair of heavy iron handcuffs swinging from a leather belt. Artie and Maeve exchanged a look of pure terror in the dim light of the penlight, realizing they were trapped in the furthest corner of a collapsing basement with a ruined leg, an unmapped shaft beneath them, and the most dangerous man in the city closing in on their position with a formal court order in his hand. But as Artie's fingers tightened around the three-pronged bronze key, a low mechanical thunk echoed from inside the cavity behind the fallen beam, and the massive iron safe embedded in the brick wall gave a sudden, violent lurch, its solid casing of black ice cracking wide open as the entire multi-ton iron structure began to slide slowly, inexorably downward toward the open hatch, threatening to drag the remaining foundation walls down into the dark water below before they could ever find a way to escape. The heavy bronze, three-pronged key slipped into the custom lockbox mechanism with a cold, precise smoothness that seemed to defy the decades of damp grime enveloping the icehouse. Arthur Vance leaned his full weight forward, his hands raw and trembling from the dust of the collapsed ceiling, while his sprained left ankle throbbed with a fiery, hot agony that made his vision blur into a haze of gray grit. Beside him in the dim, piercing white beam of the single backup penlight, Maeve Lynn pressed her shoulder against the side of the massive iron safe, her breath escaping in jagged, frantic clouds of white mist as she used her full weight to counteract the multi-ton vault's sudden, terrifying downward slant toward the open hatchway. This was a desperate, immediate relationship interaction, their fingers tangling over the cold, bronze grip as the rumble of Richard Sterling's approaching footsteps echoed from the concrete corridor upstairs. A slow, arrogant, and rhythmic clicking of polished leather shoes that gave them only a matter of minutes before they would be caught in the collapsing foundation. The practical problem of their physical entrapment was worsening by the second. The partial collapse of the secondary timber support beam had not only pinned Artie's leg moments before, but it had also initiated a catastrophic chain reaction throughout the load-bearing masonry, causing the thick casing of unyielding black ice around the safe to split wide open with a succession of sharp, violent pops that sounded like pistol shots in the confined space. "Artie, you have to turn it now. The internal balance levers are shifting," Maeve cried out, her voice a tight, breathless string of panic as she strained against the tilting iron frame, her knuckles turning bone white under the faint beam of the penlight. Artie gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his ankle, twisting the bronze key 90 degrees clockwise until a deep, resonant thunk echoed from deep within the safe's reinforced iron core, followed immediately by a sudden, violent hiss of pressurized, 60-year-old frozen air that rushed out through the widening seam of the door and extinguished the ambient scent of rot and soot with an icy, chemical sweetness. It was an intense, emotional moment for the 39-year-old draftsman. As the heavy iron door swung slowly outward on its ancient, greaseless hinges, the realization that he was finally looking into the absolute heart of the riddle that had destroyed his family name brought a sudden choking wave of grief to his throat. A sharp memory of his mother dying in poverty while this hidden monument of ice and iron stood waiting for his touch. The interior of the safe was perfectly preserved, entirely free of the waterlogging and mold that had claimed the rest of the warehouse infrastructure, its velvet-lined compartments holding several rows of pristine, ice-chilled leather binders that bore the distinctive legal stamps of the old Riverfront Trust. Maeve directed her narrow penlight beam into the top shelf, her fingers darting forward to pull out the first document capsule, revealing a critical new clue that completely reoriented their understanding of the property's defense system. Attached to the primary binder was a hand-drawn schematic detailing a series of low-voltage electrolytic conduits that fed directly into a massive, hidden iron radiator assembly buried beneath the floorboards, proving that the safe's ice wall wasn't just an insulation barrier, but an active structural counterweight designed to keep the entire building from sliding into the canal. As Artie unclasped the brass binding of the main ledger, a faded newspaper clipping from November of 1961 fluttered out onto the stone floor, its headline detailing a mysterious, unmapped fire that had destroyed the municipal records office the exact week his grandfather had sealed the vault. An event that left a terrifying, immediate, unanswered question hanging over the ruins. If the official city land registries had been completely obliterated in that historical blaze, what legal authority did Richard Sterling's family actually use to claim ownership of the surrounding luxury condo lots? And who had originally authorized the construction of the secret subsurface drilling platform directly beneath their feet? Before Maeve could scan the first page of the land deeds, the shadow of a tall, imposing figure fell across the arched entryway of the vault chamber. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight cutting through the floating dust to illuminate the wreckage of the ceiling and freeze the two of them in a brilliant, blinding glare. Richard Sterling stepped into the room, his tailored charcoal overcoat immaculate despite the debris, his hand resting calmly on a heavy iron crowbar as his gray, unblinking eyes settled on the open safe door with a mixture of cold corporate rage and absolute calculation. "You've been remarkably resourceful, Arthur, just like your stubborn old grandfather," Sterling said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of human empathy as he took a slow, deliberate step over the fallen timber joists. his assistant tracking behind him with a leather briefcase that rattled with the metallic sound of legal injunctions and zip ties. "But you're entirely out of time. The probate court has just signed the emergency condemnation mandate, and my crews are already clearing the perimeter for the high-density polyurethane injection." Maeve stood her ground, her historical trust badge raised as she shielded the open safe with her body, her voice ringing with a fierce, professional defiance. "We have the original collective deeds. Sterling, this safe proves your father forged the riverfront titles after the municipal fire of 1961, she shouted, her words echoing loudly off the cracked brickwork. Sterling didn't blink. Instead, he offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, his hand tightening on the iron bar as he looked from Artie's mangled boot to the heavy brass grate of the floor drain, where the distant rumble of the industrial drill suddenly resumed its slow, heavy screech from the dark water below. "A deed is only valuable if the building holding it remains standing to verify the foundation coordinates, Ms. Lynn," Sterling whispered, his tone hardening into an iron command as he raised the crowbar toward the remaining timber pillar. A terrifying cliffhanger of choice hanging over the room as the massive iron safe gave another violent lurch, its multi-ton frame beginning to slide rapidly down the opening hatchway, threatening to drag Artie, Maeve, and the entire historical registry into the flooded abyss before they could read a single signature. The heavy iron safe gave a final agonizing lurch, its ancient casement of black ice shattering completely as the multi-ton structure slid through the open hatchway and plummeted into the flooded secondary basement with a deafening, echoing splash that sent a torrent of cold, mineral-heavy water rushing up into the vault room. Arthur Vance collapsed against the base of a vibrating timber pillar, his breath tearing from his raw throat in ragged, frantic gasps, while his sprained left ankle throbbed with a white-hot, agonizing intensity that made his vision blur into a haze of gray grit and floating horsehair insulation. The immediate practical problem was suffocating the structural integrity of the ice house was actively unraveling. The air thick with the smell of pulverized fire brick, dry rot, and the burning friction of the industrial drill below, leaving him and Maeve Lynn trapped in a dark, rapidly flooding cavern with an arrogant corporate mogul who held all the legal cards. This was a brutal, high-stakes relationship interaction. Their fingers locked together over the cold handle of the three-pronged bronze key as Richard Sterling stepped over the fallen timber joists, his tactical flashlight cutting through the dense haze to pin them against the wet masonry like specimens in a laboratory. The sheer, predatory calculation in Sterling's gray eyes sent a chill through Artie's chest that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature of the room. The developer raised a heavy iron crowbar, his posture radiating an absolute administrative certainty that the law, the city council, and the bulldozers outside would erase this entire block before the noon sun could hit the riverfront. "Give me the binders, Arthur," Sterling said, his smooth, resonant voice entirely devoid of human empathy as his assistant stepped forward, clicking open a heavy leather briefcase that rattled with the chilling, metallic sound of zip ties and emergency court injunctions. "Your grandfather was a broken, delusional old man who spent 60 years freezing pieces of paper into a wall while his own daughter died in a charity ward. And you are nothing but a trespasser in a building that has already been legally condemned by the state." It was an intense, emotional moment for Artie, a crushing wave of inherited grief and exhaustion that threatened to drop him to his knees. He looked at his own grease-stained hands, then at the rows of pristine, ice-chilled leather binders that had rolled out of the shattered safe onto the wet stone, realizing that his mother's lifetime of poverty wasn't a mistake. It was the tragic cost of a multi-generational war to protect the literal survival of the immigrant families who had built this city. Maeve didn't flinch. She shifted her body directly between Sterling and the documents. Her historical trust credentials held high as she directed her slender penlight toward the open pages of the primary ledger, revealing a critical new clue that completely shattered the corporate ownership titles taped to the back of the 1961 registry. Was a certified municipal tax receipt bearing an encrypted watermark from the state treasury, proving that Harlan Vance had personally paid the land rents for the entire Canal District 48 hours after the official city archives had supposedly burned to the ground. This meant the Sterling family's current deeds weren't just fraudulent. They were built on an active, ongoing theft that could be legally prosecuted if the original receipts were delivered to a federal judge before the noon demolition crews ignited their engines. But as Artie's trembling fingers traced the ancient watermark, a sudden sharp vibration ran through the floorboards, and a low, mechanical click resonated from the vintage diving suit propped against the flooded sub-basement wall below, introducing a terrifying, immediate unanswered question that hung over the entire baseline mystery. If Richard Sterling was standing right here in the vault room with a crowbar in his hand, what secondary mechanism or hidden entity was actively controlling the automated drill rig that was still boring upward through the foundation bedrock? And why did the water level in the drain suddenly begin to rise with a violent, bubbling heat that threatened to scald their remaining footing? Sterling saw the watermark, his polished corporate facade cracking for a fraction of a second to reveal a desperate, dangerous panic as he lunged forward with the crowbar, his heavy boot pinning Maeve's foot to the stone as he reached for the binders. Artie, ignoring the agonizing fire in his ankle, threw his entire upper body weight into Sterling's legs, his hands clawing at the expensive charcoal overcoat as they tumbled together into the freezing grit. The heavy iron bar clattering across the granite floorboards and sliding straight through the dark. Open gaps of the floor drain into the boiling abyss below, leaving them completely blind as Maeve's fragile penlight batteries finally failed, plunging the collapsing ice house into a terrifying, suffocating darkness that echoed with the unmistakable roar of an approaching structural failure. The darkness was thick and choking, but it was not absolute. Through the heavy, rising vapor of the flooded sub-basement, a shaft of sharp, golden morning light suddenly cut through the fractured masonry of the eastern wall. The storm had passed. The mechanical roar of the drill had died, replaced by the hollow, rhythmic sloshing of river water stabilizing within the newly exposed drainage channels below. Arthur Vance lay on his side, his hands raw and bleeding, his chest heaving as the dust slowly settled around him. Beside him, Maeve Lynn was already moving, her fingers frantically sweeping the grid until she found the heavy leather binders that had rolled from the shattered safe. They were damp, but the thick, ice-chilled leather had done its job. The parchment inside remained perfectly intact. Richard Sterling was gone, having fled into the fog the moment the structural timbers groaned their final warning, leaving his corporate empire to collapse under the weight of the evidence he had failed to bury. Artie looked up at the towering brick arches of the ice house, feeling a profound, quiet warmth bloom within his chest that completely banished the lingering chill of the winter. He was no longer a ghost slipping through the cracks of an indifferent city. He was the keeper of a forgotten community's foundation. In the weeks that followed, the certified municipal tax receipts and the 1961 Riverfront Trust ledger were delivered directly to a federal district judge, triggering a sweeping investigation that frozen every development asset held by the Sterling Group and restored the legal land deeds to the dozens of immigrant families whose histories had been hidden behind the black ice. The ice house itself was not demolished. With the help of Maeve's engineering trust, and a massive municipal preservation grant. The monolithic structure was systematically shored up, its cavernous vaults transformed into a vibrant cultural center and archive for the historic Canal District. Artie didn't sell the property for quick cash. Instead, he took up residence in the restored brick office on the main floor. His drafting tables once again covered in blueprints not for corporate high-rises, but for the restoration of his neighborhood. Sitting at his grandfather's old iron desk on a crisp, bright November morning, Artie carefully unfolded the final personal letter from the leather pouch, his thumb tracing the elegant script of his mother's name. The true inheritance wasn't the brick, the iron, or the land. It was the realization that he had finally found his way home. His family's long, silent sacrifice, vindicated by the life now returning to the stone walls around him. He looked out the window as a group of local children walked past the restored iron double doors, their laughter echoing clearly through the morning air. And for the first time in 39 years, Arthur Vance smiled, knowing the foundation beneath his feet was completely secure.